What happened to Nancy Guthrie? That is the question that has refused to disappear. In the early morning hours of February 1st, 2026, an 84-year-old woman vanished from her home in Tucson, Arizona. Her name was Nancy Guthrie. She was a mother, a grandmother, and a woman whose daughter happened to be one of the most recognizable faces in American television. But Nancy was not a public figure because of her own career. Her connection to the national spotlight came through her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, the longtime Today Show host whose face millions of Americans had seen on their television screens. And yet, when Nancy disappeared, the attention surrounding the case was not enough to answer the most basic question. Where was she? For the people who knew Nancy, the circumstances were immediately alarming. This was not a healthy woman who could simply decide to leave her home and disappear for days. Nancy was 84 years old. She had serious mobility limitations. She depended on medication. Her daily routine was important to her health and well-being. If Nancy had simply walked away from her home, there should have been questions about where she could have gone, how far she could have traveled, and why she would have left behind the things she needed most. But those questions became even more troubling when investigators began looking at what was left behind. Her purse was still there. Her keys were still there. Her phone was still there. Her hearing aid was still there. Her identification was still there. And perhaps most importantly, her medication was still inside the home. For an elderly woman with mobility problems, those details were difficult to ignore. Then there was the door. The back doors were reportedly found propped open. And the security system had raised another disturbing alarm. At some point around the time Nancy disappeared, her doorbell camera disconnected. And then communication between her pacemaker and her phone stopped. Two separate technologies connected to Nancy's safety and well-being had gone silent. Was that a coincidence? Was it the result of a technical problem? Or did something happen inside or around the home that caused both systems to stop functioning? Those questions would become central to an investigation that would eventually involve local detectives, federal agents, private laboratories, volunteer searchers, forensic specialists, Ransom communications, anonymous tips, and a masked figure who appeared on surveillance footage outside Nancy's home. But before any of those developments occurred, there was simply a family waiting for Nancy to show up. And she never did. The previous evening had appeared to be ordinary. Nancy had spent time having dinner with her daughter Annie and her son-in-law Tommaso. There was nothing about that evening, based on the information publicly described, that suggested it would be the last time Nancy's family would see her before she disappeared. After dinner, Tommaso reportedly drove Nancy home. That detail would later become important. He did not simply drop her somewhere in the neighborhood. He reportedly waited until Nancy entered her home. At least from the family's perspective, she was safely inside. The night continued. Hours passed, and then something changed. The doorbell camera disconnected. The pacemaker's communication with Nancy's phone stopped. And somewhere during those early morning hours, investigators believe something happened. Exactly what that something was remains unknown. The next morning, Nancy was expected to participate in a virtual church service. But she did not appear. At first, that might have seemed like a minor change in plans. People miss appointments. People sleep late. Technology fails. But Nancy's absence quickly became concerning because it was inconsistent with her normal routine. A friend who noticed Nancy was not present reportedly contacted Annie and Tommaso. And when they went to Nancy's home, the situation became much more serious. Nancy was not there, but her belongings were. The things she would normally need if she were going somewhere were still inside. The medication she depended on was still inside. Her keys were still inside. Her phone was still inside. Her hearing aid was still inside. Her purse was still inside. And the doors at the back of the house were reportedly propped open. This was not the scene of an elderly woman who had simply gone for a walk. At least, that was not how the evidence appeared. The question became whether Nancy had left voluntarily at all. And almost immediately, another question followed. If Nancy had not left voluntarily, who had taken her? The possibility of an abduction began to emerge. That possibility was not based on one single piece of evidence. It came from the totality of the circumstances. Nancy's age, her mobility limitations, her medication, the fact that essential personal belongings remained behind, the disconnected security equipment, the open doors, and later, physical evidence discovered outside the home. Together, those details created a picture that investigators could not simply dismiss. But the investigation would soon take a dramatic turn. A day after Nancy disappeared, a ransom communication reportedly appeared. The message was sent to a local news station. The writer claimed to have Nancy, and the demand was enormous. Millions of dollars in Bitcoin. The message reportedly contained details about Nancy's clothing and items inside her home. That detail immediately raised the stakes. If the person who wrote the message truly had Nancy, how did they know what she had been wearing? How did they know details about the inside of her residence? Was the writer actually connected to the disappearance? Or was someone attempting to exploit a national tragedy for financial gain? The problem was that the communication did not provide something Nancy's family desperately needed. Proof of life. There was no confirmed evidence that Nancy was alive. No photograph that could be independently verified. No video. No direct communication from Nancy herself. No information that conclusively demonstrated that the person making the demand actually possessed the missing woman. And this created a dangerous dilemma. The family had to consider the possibility that Nancy was alive. They also had to consider the possibility that someone was lying. And they had no way of knowing which possibility was true. Nancy's children eventually made an emotional public appeal. They pleaded with whoever might have Nancy to make contact. They said they were willing to communicate, but they needed proof. Proof that Nancy was alive. Proof that the person making the demands truly had her. The family was caught in a nightmare. If the ransom communication was legitimate, every moment mattered. If it was a hoax, every minute spent chasing it could take investigators away from the real evidence. And if Nancy was already dead, the ransom demand could have been designed to delay the investigation or manipulate the family. At that point, there was no clear answer. Then came another development. A second ransom communication reportedly appeared. And this time, the message was even more disturbing. The writer suggested that Nancy had died. The claim was reportedly that her death had been accidental. That raised an entirely new set of questions. If Nancy had been kidnapped for ransom, why would the kidnappers admit that she was dead? Why continue demanding money? Why claim that her death was accidental? And if the person who wrote the first communication truly had Nancy alive, what had happened between the first message and the second? Was the second communication written by the same person? Was someone trying to create a false trail? Was the entire ransom story fabricated from the beginning? Or had something gone terribly wrong during an actual kidnapping? These questions remain unresolved. But the ransom communications were not the only evidence that changed the direction of the case. There was something else. Blood. Blood was reportedly discovered outside Nancy's front door. And later testing reportedly confirmed that the blood belonged to Nancy. That was a major development. Because blood evidence can transform an investigation. It can tell investigators that a person was injured. It can establish that someone was physically present in a particular location. And, depending on how the blood was deposited, it can potentially provide clues about what happened. In Nancy's case, forensic analysis reportedly raised the possibility that she was alive and close to the ground when the blood was deposited. If accurate, that could suggest that Nancy suffered an injury near the entrance to her home. But blood does not automatically tell investigators the entire story. It does not, by itself, explain who caused the injury. It does not necessarily establish whether Nancy was attacked. It does not reveal whether the injury occurred accidentally or intentionally. And it does not prove what happened afterward. Yet the presence of Nancy's blood outside her home, combined with the other evidence, made the possibility of a violent confrontation increasingly difficult to ignore. Somewhere near the entrance to Nancy's home, something may have happened. The question is what? And who was there? Investigators would eventually uncover another piece of the puzzle.
Surveillance footage.
The FBI reportedly released recovered footage showing a masked individual outside Nancy's home. The figure became known publicly as the porch guy. The footage appeared to show a man wearing a mask and gloves. He was reportedly carrying a backpack that appeared to be full. and there were indications that he may have been attempting to conceal or interfere with the doorbell camera. That detail was significant. If the individual knew about the camera, then the obvious question was whether he had planned to avoid being recorded. Was this simply someone attempting to conceal his identity? Or was he deliberately targeting the security system? The behavior of the man also became a subject of intense scrutiny. He did not appear, based on descriptions of the footage, to be acting in obvious panic. He appeared relatively calm. That calmness led investigators and observers to ask whether the person knew exactly what he was doing. Could this have been a random intruder? Or was this someone who had planned the visit? The backpack became another point of interest. If the person had arrived with an apparently full backpack, what was inside? Tools? Clothing? Equipment? Something intended to assist with an abduction? Or something completely unrelated? The footage alone could not answer those questions, but it created a new possibility. Perhaps Nancy's disappearance was not a spontaneous event. Perhaps someone had prepared. And perhaps someone had studied the location before making their move. That possibility became even more intriguing when investigators and online observers began examining the surveillance footage in greater detail. Some questions emerged about whether certain images may have been captured on an earlier night. If that interpretation were correct, it could suggest that the person seen near Nancy's home had been there before. And if someone had been watching the property before Nancy disappeared, the case would take on a very different character.
Surveillance.
Planning. Target selection. Knowledge. These concepts matter because they could change the fundamental question investigators are asking. Instead of asking, who happened to come across Nancy? Investigators might need to ask, who had been watching Nancy? There is a profound difference between those two possibilities. A random criminal sees an opportunity. A planned offender creates an opportunity. The evidence has not publicly established which scenario applies to Nancy's case. But the possibility of prior surveillance is one of the reasons the masked figure has attracted so much attention. The figure's appearance near the home may not have been the beginning of the story. It may have been the final stage of something that began much earlier. And if that is true, someone may have known Nancy's routine. Someone may have known when she was home. Someone may have known that she had mobility limitations. Someone may have known that she lived alone. Someone may have known that she was vulnerable. And someone may have known how to approach her home. But again, these are questions, not established facts. The investigation has not publicly identified the masked individual as the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance. That distinction is critical. The public may look at the footage and immediately assume the person is responsible. But investigators need more than suspicion. They need evidence. They need to establish identity. They need to establish motive. They need to establish opportunity. They need to establish what happened. And they need to connect the person to Nancy. That process can take time. In the meantime, investigators explored other leads. Some individuals were examined. Some locations were searched. One man was reportedly detained near the U.S.-Mexico border. Another investigation reportedly involved a mother and son. But neither investigation produced a publicly known connection to Nancy's disappearance. At one point, a pair of gloves found in the area appeared potentially significant. Gloves can be important in a criminal investigation because someone attempting to avoid leaving fingerprints may wear them. But the discovery of gloves does not automatically make them evidence of a crime. In this case, the gloves were reportedly connected to another individual and did not provide the breakthrough investigators needed. Another promising lead disappeared. Another question remained unanswered. And the investigation continued. But as time passed, another problem emerged. The relationship between local and federal investigators became a subject of controversy. The Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI were reportedly not always in agreement about aspects of the investigation. Questions were raised about the handling of the initial crime scene. Questions were raised about evidence collection. Questions were raised about the timing of forensic analysis. And questions were raised about why some evidence was reportedly sent to a private laboratory rather than immediately processed by the FBI. In any major criminal investigation, evidence management is critical. The first hours can be the most important. Crime scenes change. Weather can destroy evidence. People can unknowingly contaminate areas. objects can be moved, and memories can fade. That is why investigators are trained to secure scenes and document evidence as quickly as possible. In Nancy's case, criticism surrounding the early investigation became part of the larger story. The public wanted to know whether every possible piece of evidence had been preserved, whether every lead had been pursued, whether local authorities and federal agents were working together effectively, and whether disagreements between agencies had slowed progress. Those questions became even more prominent as Sheriff Chris Nanos came under increasing criticism. Critics questioned his leadership and communication during the investigation. Reports also surfaced regarding his previous disciplinary history. The local deputies' organization reportedly voted no confidence in his leadership. But it is important to distinguish between criticism of leadership and proof of investigative failure. A vote of no confidence does not establish that an investigation was mishandled. Criticism does not automatically mean evidence was lost. And disagreement between agencies does not necessarily mean investigators were not working. Still, public confidence matters. When a case involves a missing elderly woman, a high-profile family, possible ransom demands, and an apparent abduction, every decision becomes subject to scrutiny. The longer Nancy remains missing, the more intensely those decisions are examined. And the more unanswered questions there are, the more the public begins to search for its own explanations. That is how theories begin. One possibility is that Nancy was kidnapped for ransom. The ransom communications would appear to support that theory. But there are problems. The messages did not provide confirmed proof of life. And the second communication reportedly claimed Nancy had died. If the kidnapping was genuinely motivated by money, why would the offender risk revealing that the victim was dead? Would a criminal demanding millions of dollars not have every incentive to prove the victim was alive? Then there is another theory. Perhaps Nancy was targeted because of her connection to Savannah Guthrie. Savannah is a nationally recognized television personality. Her family is publicly known. That visibility could theoretically make the family a target. But public recognition alone does not prove motive. A person who targets a family because of wealth or fame would presumably need to know the family's financial circumstances, routines, and vulnerabilities. That leads back to the possibility of surveillance. Was Nancy chosen because of who she was? Or was she simply vulnerable? There is also the possibility of a burglary that went wrong. Perhaps someone entered the home intending to steal. Perhaps Nancy encountered the intruder. Perhaps a confrontation followed. And perhaps the situation escalated beyond what the offender initially intended. If that were the case, the ransom communications could have been an attempt to disguise the original crime. But again, there is no confirmed evidence establishing this theory. Another theory involves what some commentators have described as a wrench attack, a term used to describe criminals targeting wealthy individuals or families because they believe money can be extracted from them. This theory would suggest that someone may have viewed Nancy as a gateway to the Guthrie family's wealth. But the question remains, who would have had enough knowledge to plan such an attack? And why Nancy? There is also the possibility that someone knew Nancy personally. Perhaps someone familiar with her schedule. Someone who knew her medical condition. Someone who understood her routines. Someone who knew when she would be alone. That theory does not necessarily mean the person was a close friend. Knowledge can be obtained in many ways. Neighbors observe. Workers notice. People talk. Social media reveals information. And criminals can conduct surveillance. The challenge is determining which information was publicly available and which information could only have been known by someone with direct access. Then there is the most sensitive theory of all. Could someone close to Nancy have been involved? Whenever a person disappears from a secure location, investigators naturally examine the people closest to them. That is standard investigative procedure. Family members may be interviewed. Friends may be interviewed. Caregivers may be questioned. People who had access to the home may be examined. But public speculation can go far beyond evidence. In Nancy's case, members of the Guthrie family were reportedly cleared as suspects. That does not mean every question has been answered. It means that, based on the information available, investigators did not identify the family as responsible for Nancy's disappearance. The distinction is important. An investigation can examine someone without accusing them. A person can be questioned without being a suspect. And a person can be considered a person of interest without being charged with a crime. The public, however, often wants a simple answer. Who did it? But investigators have to work with evidence. And sometimes the evidence does not immediately point in one direction. In Nancy's case, the evidence appears to point towards several possibilities at once. The blood suggests something happened near the home. The surveillance footage suggests someone was present. The ransom communications suggest someone wanted money. The missing medication suggests Nancy did not leave voluntarily. The disconnected security equipment raises questions about timing. The possible surveillance raises questions about planning. And the lack of a confirmed body leaves investigators without one of the most important pieces of evidence in a disappearance that may have become a homicide. Then there is DNA. Advanced forensic testing has reportedly been conducted on evidence recovered during the investigation. Among the evidence discussed publicly is a mixed DNA sample reportedly associated with a hair. But mixed DNA is complicated. If genetic material from multiple individuals is present, scientists must determine how many contributors there may be and whether any contributor can be reliably identified. That process can be extremely difficult. A partial DNA profile may not produce a clear match. A mixed sample may contain too little genetic material. Environmental exposure can degrade evidence. And even if DNA from an unknown person is identified, investigators still need to determine how it got there. Finding someone's DNA does not automatically prove they committed a crime. It can show that a person was in contact with an object or location. But the timing of that contact may be unknown. The circumstances may be unclear. And investigators must build the rest of the case around the forensic evidence. That is why DNA testing in Nancy's case could become so important. If investigators can identify an unknown contributor and establish a meaningful connection to the crime scene, the investigation could move forward. But if the DNA belongs to someone whose presence can be explained, the evidence may lead nowhere. This is the nature of forensic investigation. Every piece of evidence creates another question. And sometimes the answer to one question creates three more. The blood outside Nancy's home creates questions about what happened there. The masked man creates questions about identity. The ransom notes create questions about motive. The DNA creates questions about who may have been present. And the missing woman herself creates the biggest question of all. Where is Nancy? More than 4 months after her disappearance, that question remains unanswered. And for her family, the passage of time does not make the mystery easier. It makes it heavier. Every day without Nancy is another day without certainty. Another day without knowing whether she is alive. Another day without knowing whether she was taken. Another day without knowing who may have been responsible. Savannah Guthrie has continued to speak about her mother publicly. Her emotional appeals have reminded the public that behind every missing person investigation is a family living through uncertainty. Nancy is not simply a case file. She is a mother. She is a grandmother. She is a person whose family wants to know what happened to her. And somewhere, potentially, there is someone who knows. That may be the most important fact in the entire case. Someone may know what happened to Nancy. Someone may know who entered the property. Someone may know who the masked individual is. Someone may know why the ransom communications were sent. Someone may know whether Nancy was transported somewhere. Someone may know whether she was alive after leaving the home. And someone may know whether the anonymous claims and theories circulating around this case have any truth behind them. The challenge for investigators is finding that person. The challenge for the public is resisting the temptation to fill the gaps with assumptions. Because the truth may be hidden inside those gaps. The critical period remains the early morning hours of February 1st. Nancy had been home. Then something happened. The doorbell camera went offline. The pacemaker stopped communicating with her phone. Later, her family found her belongings inside. The back doors were open. And Nancy was gone. If the disappearance was planned, the offender may have known exactly what they were doing. If it was spontaneous, the offender may have made mistakes. If the ransom demands were genuine, the person behind them may have been motivated by money. If they were false, someone may have been attempting to exploit the family's desperation. If the masked man is connected, investigators need to identify him. If he is not connected, investigators must determine who else could have entered Nancy's home. Every possibility remains tied to one central question. What happened during the hours when Nancy disappeared? That period of time may contain the entire answer. Somewhere between the last confirmed sighting of Nancy and the discovery that she was missing, a sequence of events occurred. The challenge is reconstructing it. Investigators must determine who was present, who was nearby, who had access, who had motive, who had knowledge, who may have been watching, and who may have left without being seen. The surveillance footage could be a critical part of that reconstruction. But surveillance footage has limitations. A camera may show a person approaching. It may show a person leaving. But what happened between those moments? Was Nancy inside? Was she already gone? Did someone enter? Did someone leave? Was the masked man alone? Was another person nearby? Could another vehicle have been involved? These questions become even more important when investigators consider the possibility of multiple offenders. The backpack seen in the footage has fueled speculation. The gloves have fueled speculation. The apparent attempt to interfere with security equipment has fueled speculation. But none of these details, individually, identifies the person responsible. The investigation must connect them. That is where forensic science becomes critical. A fingerprint, a DNA profile, a fiber, a digital record, a vehicle, a phone location, a financial transaction, a witness. Any one of these could potentially break open the case. But until that evidence emerges, the mystery remains. There is also the possibility that investigators are working with evidence the public knows nothing about. That is an important consideration. In major criminal investigations, authorities often withhold certain information. They may keep evidence secret to protect the integrity of the case. They may withhold details that only the perpetrator would know. They may intentionally avoid revealing information because they want to test future statements against known facts. So when the public asks why investigators have not released more information, the answer may not be that investigators have nothing. It may be that they are protecting what they have. That is why the absence of public information should not automatically be interpreted as the absence of investigative progress. At the same time, the lack of a public breakthrough can be frustrating, especially when a case appears to contain so many pieces.
Blood. Surveillance.
Ransom notes. DNA.
Possible surveillance.
Potential suspects. Searches. Rewards.
Tips.
And yet Nancy remains missing. The question becomes whether these pieces belong to the same puzzle, or whether investigators are dealing with several unrelated events that have been connected only because they occurred around the same disappearance. That distinction could be critical. Suppose the masked man is connected. Then investigators may have a direct path toward Nancy's abduction. Suppose the ransom notes are genuine. Then investigators may have evidence of motive. Suppose the DNA belongs to the offender. Then investigators may have a way to identify that person. But what if the masked man and the ransom writer are different people? What if the ransom notes were a hoax? What if the blood evidence points to an event that happened before the disappearance? What if the person responsible never appeared on camera? Every one of those possibilities changes the direction of the investigation. That is why investigators cannot simply follow the most dramatic theory. They must follow the evidence. And the evidence must survive scrutiny. The case has also generated intense public interest because of Nancy's connection to Savannah Guthrie. That national attention can be both helpful and challenging. On one hand, public attention can generate tips. People who know something may feel pressure to come forward. Witnesses may remember details. A person who recognizes a suspect may contact authorities. But attention can also produce misinformation. Online communities can amplify rumors. Unverified claims can spread rapidly. People can become convinced of theories that have never been proven. And once a theory becomes popular, it can be difficult to separate fact from speculation. That is why the investigation must remain grounded in evidence. The question is not what sounds most believable. The question is what can be proven. And right now, there are still major things that cannot be proven. There is no publicly identified suspect. There is no confirmed location where Nancy was taken. There is no confirmed proof that she is alive. There is no confirmed proof of where she died. if she did die. There is no publicly established motive. And there is no confirmed explanation for the ransom communications. Those are enormous gaps. But perhaps the most troubling question concerns the person who may have entered Nancy's world that night. If the masked individual was responsible, he may know exactly what happened. If he was not responsible, someone else may know. And if someone planned the disappearance, that person may have been watching Nancy long before the night she vanished. The possibility of surveillance changes everything. Because surveillance suggests patience. It suggests preparation. It suggests that the person responsible may have spent time learning the environment. A person who simply wanted to commit a random burglary might not know when Nancy would be home. But someone who had watched the house could. Someone who had observed her routine could know when she was alone. Someone who had studied the cameras could know where they were. Someone who understood her mobility limitations could know that she would be unable to resist or escape easily. And someone who knew about her family could understand the enormous emotional pressure a disappearance would create. But again, none of that establishes that surveillance occurred. It is simply one possibility investigators must consider. The same is true of the theory that Nancy may have been targeted because of her daughter's public profile. Savannah Guthrie is a prominent television personality. That is a fact. But whether her mother's disappearance was connected to her fame remains unknown. The person responsible may have known the family, or may have known only Nancy, or may have chosen Nancy for reasons that have nothing to do with her daughter. There may be a motive that investigators have not yet discovered. And until that motive is known, it is difficult to understand the crime. Sometimes motive is obvious. Sometimes it is hidden. Sometimes investigators identify the person responsible before they understand why the crime occurred. And sometimes motive is never fully explained. In Nancy's case, investigators are reportedly treating the disappearance as a possible kidnapping for ransom. That classification is significant, but it does not necessarily mean the ransom theory is proven. Investigations evolve. A case may begin as one type of crime and later become something else. Evidence can change the classification. New information can overturn old assumptions. A person who initially appears to be a victim of kidnapping may ultimately be discovered to have been killed. A ransom demand may turn out to be fraudulent. A suspect may turn out to be a witness. And a seemingly unrelated piece of evidence may become the key to the entire case. That is why the investigation must remain open to new possibilities. And that is also why the public should be cautious about declaring the case solved based on incomplete information. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie remains a mystery, but it is not a mystery without evidence. There is evidence. The problem is that investigators have not yet been able to connect all of it. The blood is evidence. The surveillance footage is evidence. The disconnected security systems are evidence. The ransom communications are evidence. The DNA is evidence. The belongings left behind are evidence. But evidence only becomes meaningful when it forms a coherent story. Right now, the story is incomplete. Perhaps the masked man will eventually be identified. Perhaps the DNA will produce a breakthrough. Perhaps someone will come forward. Perhaps another ransom communication will reveal something unexpected. Perhaps investigators will uncover a hidden connection between Nancy and someone who has not yet been publicly linked to the case. Or perhaps the answer will come from a piece of evidence that investigators have not yet fully understood. That is what makes unresolved cases so difficult. The answer can be hidden in plain sight. A detail that seemed insignificant may become critical. A witness who seemed unimportant may remember something. A camera image may reveal a vehicle. A DNA sample may produce a match. A financial record may establish a connection. A phone may reveal a location. And a person who has remained silent may finally decide to speak. For Nancy's family, that is the hope. That somewhere, someone has the information needed to bring this case closer to a resolution. The disappearance of an 84-year-old woman should never become just another forgotten headline. Every missing person deserves to be found. Every family deserves answers. And every unresolved investigation deserves to be examined carefully. But the most important question remains the simplest. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Was she taken from her home? Was the masked figure the person responsible? Was the disappearance planned? Were the ransom communications genuine? Who left Nancy's blood outside her front door? Who knew enough about her life to target her? Who knew about the cameras? Who knew her routine? And, perhaps most importantly, who knows what happened but has not yet come forward? The answers may already exist somewhere. They may exist in a laboratory. They may exist in a surveillance archive. They may exist in a phone record. They may exist in someone's memory. They may exist in a piece of DNA. Or they may exist in the mind of the person responsible. Until those answers emerge, the investigation continues. Nancy Guthrie remains missing. Her family continues to wait. Investigators continue to examine evidence. And the public continues to ask the same question that began this entire investigation. What happened to Nancy? The case has already demonstrated that every apparent breakthrough can lead to another dead end. The ransom notes did not provide certainty. The blood did not provide an identity. The surveillance footage did not provide a name. The searches did not provide Nancy. The leads did not produce a publicly known suspect. And the DNA has not yet publicly delivered the answer investigators need. But that does not mean the answer will never come. Investigations can change overnight. One new witness can change everything. One forensic result can change everything. One confession can change everything. One person deciding that they can no longer live with what they know can change everything. For Nancy's family, the hope is that the person with that information will come forward. Because behind every unanswered question is a possibility. The possibility that somewhere someone knows. Someone knows where Nancy went. Someone knows who entered the property. Someone knows what happened after the camera went offline. Someone knows why her belongings were left behind. Someone knows why the blood was outside the door. Someone knows who the masked man is. Someone knows whether the ransom notes were real. And someone may know where Nancy is today. Until that person speaks, the mystery remains. And until investigators can connect the evidence, the story remains unfinished. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her Tucson home in the early hours of February 1st, 2026. More than 4 months later, her family is still waiting. Waiting for a phone call. Waiting for a breakthrough. Waiting for an answer. And somewhere in the darkness surrounding this case is the truth. The only question is whether investigators will find it before another unanswered question takes its place. If you have information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, contact the appropriate law enforcement authorities. Even the smallest detail can sometimes become important when investigators are reconstructing a timeline. And if you found this investigation informative, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more detailed true crime stories, investigative updates, and unresolved cases. Share this video with others who may be following Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, and leave your thoughts in the comments. But always remember that behind every headline is a real person, a real family, and real people waiting for answers.